Good afternoon. The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today. The individuals lying about me are devoid of ethical standards, humility, and respect. I do not object to their ignorance, but rather I reject their mean-spirited attempts to defame my reputation. I never been friends with Epstein.
Picture this. You sue someone. You win. The judge throws the whole case out in your favor on your terms. Most people would take the win and walk away. Not here. Right now, in a federal courtroom in Manhattan, the First Lady of the United States just got a warning from a judge her own husband appointed, and the warning was basically this: quit while you are ahead. This is the strange, still unfolding legal fight between author Michael Wolff and Melania Trump, and if you think it wrapped up months ago, it did not. It is still going. It is happening this week, and it just took a turn almost nobody expected. Let's back this up and build it from the ground floor, because every piece here actually matters for understanding why a Trump-appointed judge is now the one sounding cautious. Go back to October of last year. Melania Trump's lawyer sent author Michael Wolff a letter. Wolff has written several books about Donald Trump over the years, and in interviews and social media videos he had linked Melania to the Jeffrey Epstein story, saying she played an active role in how the administration handled the Epstein files, and repeating a claim that Epstein's world was somehow part of how she and Donald Trump first met. The letter threatened Wolff with a defamation lawsuit worth $1 billion unless he retracted those statements and issued an apology. Most people, faced with $1 billion threat from the First Lady's legal team, would go quiet. Wolff did the opposite. He sued her first. He filed in New York State Court using something called an anti-SLAPP law. SLAPP stands for a strategic lawsuit against public participation, and this kind of law exists specifically to protect ordinary people and journalists from being buried under legal costs simply for speaking in public. Wolff asked a court to declare ahead of time that his comments about Melania were not defamatory, so that she could never actually collect on her billion-dollar threat. Melania's legal team responded by moving the whole case out of state court, where that anti-SLAPP protection is strongest, and into federal court using something called diversity jurisdiction, which basically applies when two people in a lawsuit live in different states. Once the case landed in federal court, her team asked the judge to throw the entire thing out. Then in April, something happened that, on paper, had nothing to do with this lawsuit, but ended up changing how the whole country looked at this story.
Good afternoon. The lies linking me with the disgraceful Jeffrey Epstein need to end today. The individuals lying about me are devoid of ethical standards, humility, and respect. I do not object to their ignorance, but rather I reject their mean-spirited attempts to defame my reputation.
Melania Trump walked into the White House and delivered a rare, roughly 6-minute, on-camera statement. She said the lies linking her to Epstein needed to end that day. She said she was never on Epstein's plane, never visited his private island, and had never been named in any deposition, court filing, or FBI interview connected to his crimes. She said plainly, "I am not Epstein's victim." She also directly addressed a 2002 email she had sent to Ghislaine Maxwell, which had surfaced in released government files, describing it as nothing more than casual, trivial correspondence. She closed by calling on Congress to hold public hearings so that Epstein's actual survivors could testify and have their stories entered permanently into the record. Here is the detail that made even seasoned reporters sit up straight. Her own husband said afterward that he had no idea she was going to say any of this. The White House had only announced 1 day earlier that the First Lady would be making some kind of statement without saying what it was about. According to people close to the situation, staff inside the administration were caught just as off guard as everyone watching at home.
Was the president as shocked as the rest of America to hear First Lady Melania speak out?
So why give a statement like that completely out of nowhere in the middle of an active lawsuit when staying quiet is almost always the safer legal move? That question was never really answered in a satisfying way. Her team said only that she had reached a breaking point after months of what she considered unfair coverage. A few weeks later, in May, the judge overseeing the Wolff case, Mary Kay Weiskakil, a Trump appointee sitting in the Southern District of New York, finally ruled. She dismissed Wolff's case. But notice how she did it. She did not rule that Melania Trump was right on the underlying facts, and she did not rule that Wolff's claims about Melania were false either. She ruled on a technicality. Wolff, she said, could not ask a federal court to declare his comments were not defamatory in advance because Melania Trump had not actually filed a defamation suit against him. There was no live dispute yet for a court to referee. In her own words, she called the whole maneuver an abusively presented spat that she would not be conscripted into overseeing, and said this simply is not how the federal courts work. Wolff is now appealing that ruling, which means this legal story is far from finished.
Tonight, the Epstein controversy is back in the public spotlight after First Lady Melania.
Here is where this gets almost funny, in a dark sort of way, if you step back and look at it plainly. You would think winning is winning. Case dismissed, First Lady comes out ahead. Everybody moves on with their lives. Instead, her legal team went right back into that same courtroom and asked the judge to sanction Michael Wolff. Sanctions mean financial penalties, on top of him already losing the case, for what her lawyers called factual misrepresentations, frivolous legal arguments, and bad faith conduct. And this is the part happening literally this week right now as you are watching this. According to court reporting, the judge sat both legal teams down and told Melania Trump's lawyers, in open court, something close to this. The case is now closed. I wonder if it is really in the interest of the parties to keep litigating in this courtroom. That same judge reminded Melania's team that winning a sanctions motion requires clear evidence that Wolff brought his case in bad faith, and that this standard places a very high burden on whoever is asking for it. She went further, telling them almost gently that sometimes people get so caught up in the heat of the moment that they forget to weigh the actual cost and the burden they are placing on the court itself before filing motion after motion. In plain, everyday language, a judge appointed by President Trump himself was standing in front of Melania Trump's own attorneys and telling them to think twice before pushing their luck any further. Her team has said they still intend to file that sanctions motion, with a deadline coming up on the 20th of this month. Sit with that for a second because it is worth repeating. This is not a judge appointed by the other party. This is not some hostile courtroom stacked against them. This is someone from their own side, someone Trump himself put on the bench, essentially saying out loud, in public, "You already won this. Why on earth are you still here?" While all of this has been playing out in a Manhattan courtroom, a much wider, messier swirl connected to this same overall story has also been building online, and plenty of you have probably already seen pieces of it. A former model named Amanda Ungaro, who was in a long, roughly 2-decade relationship with Trump ally and current special envoy Paolo Zampoli, has been making a series of public claims connecting her own past to the broader Epstein world and to Melania Trump personally, saying that over the years she witnessed what she describes as highly compromising interactions. Zampoli has firmly and repeatedly denied her account, calling parts of it distorted and accusing her of exaggerating for attention. None of this has been proven, tested, or resolved in any court of law, and it is important to say that clearly and directly. These are competing, disputed, unproven claims from two people in a bitter personal falling out, not established facts. But the sheer amount of attention this side story keeps generating shows just how far this whole saga reaches, well beyond one lawsuit between one author and one first lady, and it is part of why the Epstein question keeps circling back to Melania Trump specifically, again and again, no matter how many times her team tries to close the book on it. Now, why does any of this actually matter if you are not a lawyer and you do not spend your evenings reading federal court filings for fun? There are a few real reasons, and they go beyond just one family's legal drama. First, this entire fight was never really about a single quote or a single email exchange. Both sides have used it as a stand-in for a much bigger, more uncomfortable question, which is whether people with enormous wealth and institutional power can use the mere threat of $1 billion lawsuit to make journalists and ordinary critics go silent, even when it later turns out those critics had a legitimate legal shield the whole time. Wolff's entire argument from the very first filing was that the Trump family has a documented pattern of doing exactly this, threatening expensive litigation specifically to create what he called a climate of fear around free speech in this country. You do not have to agree with Wolff to notice that this argument is no longer just a talking point on social media. It is now sitting inside an actual federal court record with a judge's name attached to it. Second, this case keeps dragging the Epstein story back into the national conversation again and again, almost always at the exact moments when the White House clearly wants the public talking about something else entirely. Every single time it looks like this story might finally fade into the background, something new happens. A surprise statement nobody saw coming, a court ruling, now a sanctions fight, and the same uncomfortable questions come right back to the surface. Who knew what and when? And why does the First Lady of the United States keep having to publicly answer for events from decades ago? Third, and this connects to the Ungaro story I just walked you through, all of this keeps feeding a much bigger cloud of suspicion around the Trump family and the Epstein files generally, one that no single court ruling seems able to clear away, fairly or not. It is worth pausing here too because the Ungaro story on its own has already touched federal immigration matters, a custody dispute involving her teenage son, and now direct claims aimed at both Zampoli and, indirectly, at Melania Trump herself. None of that is settled either. Ungaro has said she is willing to testify before Congress if asked. Zampoli has said he welcomes exactly that kind of scrutiny because he believes it will clear his name once and for all. Until either of those things actually happens in a formal setting, under oath, everything else remains exactly what it is right now, competing public statements from two people who clearly do not agree on much of anything anymore. Here is something else worth noticing, something about how this story is actually being covered across the media landscape. Data from media tracking platforms shows that overall coverage of Melania Trump news leans heavily toward left-leaning outlets, making up roughly half of all recent coverage, with right-leaning outlets publishing noticeably less by comparison. When one side of the media landscape is covering a story so much more heavily than the other, it is worth pausing and asking yourself honestly, am I only getting half of this picture? That does not automatically mean either side is lying to you. It usually just means you have to go looking a little further on purpose if you actually want the full context, instead of simply trusting whatever headline happens to land in your feed first. Let's talk numbers for a second because they matter here too. Wolff originally threatened to be sued for $1 billion over statements he says were, in his words, protected opinion based on disclosed facts. Judge Weiskachil's opinion dismissing his case ran 45 pages long, which tells you how seriously she treated the underlying legal questions, even while refusing to rule on the merits. And now there is a second front opening up, the sanctions motion, which if it goes through could mean real financial penalties for Wolff and his legal team on top of a case they already lost outright. That is not a small thing for a working journalist to be facing, appeal or no appeal. None of this directly costs an ordinary American money the way, say, a tariff or a tax change would. But it does cost something else, and that is trust and clarity. Every time this story resurfaces, whether through a surprise White House statement, a court filing, or a sanctions fight, it becomes a little harder for regular people to keep track of what has actually been proven, what is still just an allegation, and what has already been legally settled one way or another. That confusion is not an accident. Long dragged-out litigation like this tends to blur those lines on purpose, whether that is the intention or not, simply because most people do not have the time to read a 45-page court opinion for themselves. There is also a bigger, quieter cost here, and it goes to how much regular Americans can trust the office of the First Lady itself. Whether you like Melania Trump or not, the position she holds is supposed to be one of the more unifying, less politically combative roles in Washington. When that office keeps getting pulled into billion-dollar defamation threats, surprise statements about a convicted sex offender, and now a sanctions fight against a journalist, even after winning, it changes how people see the role itself, not just the person in it. So where does all of this actually leave things? Right now, today, Wolff's original case is dead, but he is appealing that dismissal. Melania Trump already won, but her team is choosing to keep fighting anyway, pushing for sanctions in front of a judge who is openly, publicly telling them that this might not be the wisest use of anyone's time. That sanctions motion is due by the 20th of this month, which means this story is not over, not even close, no matter how many times it looks like it should be. And Wolff's own appeal of the original dismissal is still sitting out there too, meaning there are actually two separate legal tracks running in parallel right now. One where Melania is trying to punish Wolff further, and one where Wolff is trying to reverse the ruling that ended his own case. Think about how unusual that actually is. A sitting First Lady is simultaneously defending an appeal from a journalist she already legally beat, while also asking the same court system to punish that same journalist further, and doing all of it while a judge from her own husband's side of the aisle is publicly signaling that she thinks this has gone far enough. That is not a normal news week for any First Lady in modern American history, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment before you scroll past it. So here is my honest question for you. Do you think this is really about protecting a reputation at this point? Or do you think this is about sending a message to every other journalist out there who might be thinking about writing something similar someday? Write your honest takedown in the comments. I genuinely read every single one of them. And if stories like this keep you properly informed, go ahead and hit subscribe so you do not miss what happens the moment that sanctions motion actually gets filed later this month. One last thing before you go, and I think it matters. Everything you just heard is my own personal analysis, put together from public court reporting, official White House statements, and news coverage, all of which I have linked and sourced below this video. I am not a lawyer, and I am not here to tell you exactly what to believe about anyone involved. Go look at the sources yourself if you want to dig even deeper. And let's keep this conversation civil down in the comments so that we are adding something useful to the discussion instead of just adding to the noise.